Hi, I'm Cassie from BBC Good Food. Welcome to another live Q&A. I'm going to be joined shortly by Barney from the cookery team. And today we're going to be answering all of your questions about sourdough. So if you've got any questions for us, just comment below and we'll do our best to answer them in the next. Let's add Barney to the conversation. Here he comes. So yeah, we're specifically talking. Hello, Barney.
Hi, you right?
I'm good, thanks. How you doing?
Doing good. Right, let me sort my phone out.
Sourdough today, but if you've got any other questions, then feel free to answer. We're here for 30 minutes to answer all your cooking queries. So
right, good. You see me?
I can see you. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. We can see Barney on Facebook and why wonderful tips for sourdough beginner. You went back into making sourdough, didn't you? You made it before, and then since lockdown, you've made it again. So, what tips would you give beginners?
I think perseverance, really. It's about kind of feeling your way through it and finding the best way for it to work for you, and not giving up. I think a lot of people question whether their starter is working because sometimes it can take a little bit longer or sometimes less time than you expect. So just keep going with it. And in terms of once you've got the starter active and you're ready to bake, it's just about experimenting and finding out what works for you, I think.
Yeah, I would say so. I'd say, listen, there's no one way to sourdough. There's lots of different methods, and they all work for different people. And you might read a recipe that's got grapefruit juice in it. You might read another recipe that starts with yogurt. Our recipe was designed specifically for lots of different reasons, but stick with that one. Don't try and get all the different methods confused. And if it's a trend, obviously I'm very loyal to our way of doing it and to our method of doing it because it seems to have worked. And we've had some incredible results this week. But yet stick with that, and as you said, persevere, and something will eventually happen. For your actual starter, it can take anything between 4 days and 2 weeks, depending on the environment, depending on the temperature, depending on so many different aspects, but something will eventually happen.
Yeah. So we've got a question here. Can I mix flours in my starter?
You certainly can. You're good to mix. You're good to mix most flours apart. The only thing I've had trouble with are gluten-free flours. So I've had trouble with brown rice flour and teff flour, but you can mix wholemeal with white. You can mix rye with white, and they should all. To be honest, we base our good food starter on white because that gives you more variety and we like the flavour of it. But you're actually going to get more of a reaction from a wholemeal or a rye because they have more of the organic stuff that the bacteria like. Kind of they're more of a bed for activity. So actually, if you do a mixture of the two, you're more likely to get more reaction from your starter.
Yeah, I had my starter going for about a month now with white flour, and I ran out last week, so I added rye flour, and it just went mad. It's like bubbled out of the container.
Yeah. It's like magic porridge pot, doesn't it? Just keeps on bubbling over. Yeah.
Okay, how do you get the best bubbles?
Oh, so this is a funny one. So bubbles were something that people really never used to want in their bread. So when we get commercial bread, it hasn't got bubbles in it because people complain about the butter going through it but that's something that people want now because they seem to think it's a good sign of sourdough. Sourdough doesn't have to have bubbles in it to be delicious sourdough. In fact, a lot of people complain about the bubbles. But if you do want to get those beautiful Instagram bubbles, you don't want to work the bread too much. So when you're knocking it back or when you're shaping it, don't be too vigorous with it. I used to think it was to do with the hydration levels, but it's not because I got beautiful bubbles from our basic recipe yesterday. And all I did with that was, as I said, I was just quite gentle with it. And I really stuck to the timings that we give on our basic white bread recipe. I stuck to the timings. I was quite gentle with my folds. I wasn't vigorous at all. I ended up with beautiful air bubbles. In fact, if you look on the BBC, Instagram and look on their story, you'll see the loaf of bread, which is our signature white loaf, and that's got gorgeous air bubbles in it.
Okay, yeah, I think when you're making sourdough, it's kind of, you've got to like learn a new way to make bread, haven't you? If you're used to making yeasted bread and you're used to kneading it and knocking out the air on your second knead, then you need to kind of learn a new process with sourdough, because you do handle it very little.
Yeah.
Right, what else have we got? Why does my sourdough lose tone and go sticky after the final proof?
Well, I'd say your fridge might be too high. If you mean the final proof, if you're talking about once it's gone basket and then it's been in the fridge, you're either proving it too long beforehand. So you don't want, when you turn your loaf out, to be really bubbly and coming over the side of the basket. You want all that activity to happen in the oven. If at any point, like you've let it become too bubbly in the bowl, or you've let it become too bubbly in the basket, all that activity has already happened. So you kind of want that burst of activity to happen more in the oven than you want it beforehand. So I think you might be proving it for too long. So try proving it for less time and not worrying too much about it rising double beforehand, and then putting it in the oven and seeing if it goes. You might also be, I'll tell you what, temperature plays a really big part in these things, and it's only recently have I realised that. Whereas we've been having really hot days, haven't we? And today feels a bit like November. And my starter's been going like, the difference between needing to feed it every 12 hours and every 24 hours has been, on a hot day, it just goes up and down. No problem at all. It means that your starter's happened and you need to feed it. So when it splits, what you've got on top is basically like an alcohol. It's like it's called hooch, but you just need to stir that back in, and it means that all the bacteria is eating all its food in the starter, and it wants feeding again. But there's no problem at all. It actually means that your starter's doing what it's meant to do. Just give it a stir, give it a good feed, and you'll be back to where you were. Also, if your starter gets a crust on it, it's the two questions we get asked. Is mine's got a big crust on it, it just means you haven't covered it well enough. Just lift the crust off. But again, that means that your starter's doing all the right things.
Okay. What's the ideal temperature for starter? Do you know that one?
Yes, so the ideal temperature for starter is about 28 degrees. So I think the magic formula for, I think it's environment plus starter plus flour combined should be 58. So I'm going to go super geeky, but I think it's about 28 to mid 30s is the temperature you want your starter at, and that's the temperature you want to be using water at, and that's ambient. So that's kind of, you put your finger in it, you don't really you want it just to feel warm, like tepid, not not hot and not cold. So
that obviously the temperature of the water that you're adding to the starter. I mean, if you're keeping the starter at room temperature, in the fridge.
That should be about the same. It should be about 28 then.
Well, that's hot though.
28 is hot, is it? Super hot.
28 as well.
Yeah.
In the kitchen. So if you keep it in the kitchen.
Yeah. So what's your yeah, I suppose so. But what's blood temperature? When you put your finger in a glass of water, what is it?
37.
That's 37. So 28 is going to be. We're getting into a bit of an office like this. It's like the old days.
I don't know if they are talking about the water you add to the starter.
I see what you mean. So if you're taking your starter out of the fridge, then you want your starter to come to room temperature. When you feed it, you want it to be at room temperature before you use it. So you don't want it to be cold from the fridge, even though you can use it cold from the fridge, in which case you need to up the temperature of your water, but you want everything to be just past room temperature. But room temperature can mean anything, so I tend to use my touch. So when I'm feeling my dough, it shouldn't feel like anything. It shouldn't feel warm and it shouldn't feel cold. It should be the same sort of temperature as my blood.
Okay, that's interesting. I always use my starter from the fridge, so maybe I need to.
But then you're going to get a longer. So this is what I keep on saying in these Q&As. And as I said, you need to put me on geek alert. If I'm going too geeky, then you need to stop me. The longer, so you use temperature. Temperature will give you speed. So if something's warmer, it will be quicker. If something's colder, it will be longer. It will all still happen. but time equals flavour. So if you are using a cold starter and things do take a lot longer, you're going to get a lot more flavour in your bread. And that applies to all bread. You know that. I mean, that, you know, even if you're just doing a standard yeasted dough or you're making yeasted pizza dough, you put that pizza dough in the oven, in the fridge, not in the oven, in the fridge overnight rather than leaving it out for an hour, and you get a lot more flavour to it than you do. The flavour of the dough develops in the fridge regardless of whether it's sourdough or whether it's a yeasted dough.
Yeah. Okay. Spent too much time on that question. My sourdough hasn't been rising very well during baking. It rises well during proving, but the final loaf is flat. Any tips?
So that's what I was saying earlier. I think it's you're leaving it to prove for too long. So just knock the whole process back a few hours, and you want that final burst of energy to happen in the oven, not beforehand. So I would just take everything, you're doing your scheduling, just take everything back a few hours and just don't let it prove as much in the bowl and in the banneton. And then when it goes into the oven, hopefully you'll have a big airy puff of puffy loaf.
If you have a small some of the starter when you feed it, following the recipe in the magazine this month.
Yeah, of course you can. You can pour half away, and then we've actually got a guide on our website, bbcgoodfood.com, all about what to do with leftover sourdough starters. Obviously now is a time when no one wants food waste. So there are lots of things you can do. You can make it into crumpets, you can make it into pancakes. We've heard about soups, not that we've tried it. We've heard, I even recently, last day or two, I've seen a recipe for sauerkraut with sourdough starter in it. So you start your sauerkraut with some of the starter. That's the bacteria that you add to it. Again, one of my list of things to try, but you can definitely pour half away. Some methods of making a starter tell you to pour half away each day, and that's a really good way of doing it. The only reason we didn't do that when we developed our beginner sourdough was because we were trying to combat food waste, because we didn't want it. Feels counterintuitive when you do it. No one likes to pour things down the sink, but at some point, if you're making regular sourdough and you're feeding a starter regularly, it's going to come to a point when you're going to need to discard some. Give some to a neighbour. Get everyone making sourdough.
What's better, lamination or stretch and folds? Do each give the desired result?
Lamination tends to happen more with a very wet dough. They do give you the same. All you're doing with either one is you are stretching the gluten. So gluten is like chewing gum, or it's a bit like, I was thinking about it the other day. So gluten's a bit like, if you think about sweets, like penny sweets, and stop me if I'm going off on one, Cassie, because you often have to. Plain flour is a bit like a Haribo. So like you chew it and it breaks down. Yeah, there's no stretch to it. So that it crumbles in your mouth. And then strong flour is a bit like chewing gum. You get lots of elasticity to it, but you need to work at it. You need to really chew it. And that's all you're trying to do with whether you're laminating or stretch and fold. But lamination tends to happen when people are using very wet doughs because they can't stretch and fold it. So they're putting it on top of each other, a bit like making puff pastry. You do get really lovely structure and air bubbles to lamination, but when your dough is lesser hydration with the one we use, stretch and fold is absolutely fine. Stretch and fold on its own will give you amazing results. I'm now starting to go back to kneading a little bit at the beginning to see what works on that structure. But our basic white sourdough recipes is stretch and fold, 4 stretch and fold. And again, if you go on to BBC Good Food Instagram, look at the stories, look at the loaf that we've posted on there promoting this Q&A, you will see that is our standard white loaf. Nothing's been deviated from, and it's got beautiful structure, and that was from 3 stretch and folds.
Lovely. My white starter is 7 weeks old and very active and performing well. How do I make my sourdough taste less sour?
You use a fresher starter. So you feed your starter, and rather than leaving it in the fridge overnight, bake it after 3 to 4 hours, and you'll have a less sour tasting loaf of bread.
Have you got a sourdough fridge?
I haven't got a sourdough fridge. I've got quite a large fridge. I'm thinking of turning the shed into a bread shed. We need to discuss that. I need to discuss that with my wife. I might be throwing all the tools out of it and turning it into the bread shed. How do you know when your starter's ready? You use your starter. How do you know when your starter's ready?
So it should float. Is this right? Yeah, get some warm water, put a teaspoon into the water, and it should float. Although, to be honest, I don't always do that. I just have a look at it. If it looks like it's got a few bubbles, it looks quite active, then I'll use it. If not, then I'll feed it and probably use it the next day. Is that the right thing to do?
That's 100% the right thing to do. We talk about the float test a lot because it's a really easy way of doing it. But to be honest, there are lots of times the window for the sourdough starter to float is really about half an hour, and actually an hour or two before and an hour or two after, and it's still absolutely fine to use. But the only reason I keep on referring back to that is because it's such a good indication of when it's ready. And then also sometimes you need to wait for it to float as well. Like it can drop to the bottom, and then 5 minutes later you'll come back to it and it will have risen. So as long as it's looking active and it's looking really bubbly and happy, then it will generally work. But if you're unsure, and especially when you're making a starter from scratch, then yeah, the float test is a really good test to do.
Okay, great. My sourdough gets a nice crust and rises well, but it's quite dense and not the light texture it should be.
Ooh, okay, quite dense and not the light texture it should be. I would check your oven temperature. I need to double, or maybe it hasn't proved enough to start with, but maybe it's being baked so high that it's all happening, but actually it's not cooking inside. The other one would be maybe temperature. So that whole thing I think the process is happening too slowly with that when that happens. So it hasn't had enough proof to start with, and it hasn't had enough time to expand before it's gone in the oven, which is why it's still dense. Either that, or you're not stretching and folding it enough, so the gluten hasn't had enough time to form to become stretchy, which is why it's dense. Because generally with bread, when it's quite dense, you haven't worked it enough, you haven't stretched the gluten enough. So maybe try giving it more stretch and fold, or even kneading it a bit.
Okay, what's next? How do you move the dough into the baking? I guess them into the banneton.
One swift movement, just lift it up with your scraper and put it in, and then when it's gone in, you can then, so it's that thing we call sewing or weaving. It's when you bring the dough back round onto itself. So if you look into one of our videos, I think we've got one, but if not, we'll put one up. But it's when you literally pull the dough back and stretch it onto itself, sort of left to right, a bit like plaiting. And then that will just give it the last bit of a stretch that you need. But if your dough's really misshapen, then I think you're using too much water, because you should be able to. It should be in a nice ball shape anyway.
Hey, what quantities should you use when creating the starter?
What quantities should you use when you're creating a starter? It's always the same amounts of flour to water. We start with 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, and then feed each day. But whenever you're refreshing, whenever you're making a starter, it's equal quantities of flour to water. I really trust our recipe. I mean, so many people have made it. We've had some incredible breads out there. I mean, big shout out to Ben Curtis, to Jay Bealey. There was another person on our Instagram, Claire O'Leary from Lewis. I mean, they've made amazing bread from scratch using our recipe. Some recipes do starters differently. They say to mix 250 grams of water and 250 grams of flour and leave it for a week. That's never really worked for me. As I said, some people discard half each day. Our recipe seems to work. You made yours from scratch. Esther's made her from scratch. Lulu made hers from scratch. We did it when we did the videos. So ours really does work. But it's equal quantities of flour and water. They've got a problem with sorry. I was going to ask you. People are saying that their starter blocks the sink if they're pouring some away. I'd run the tap at the same time. The warm tap seems to flush it down. If not, you can just put it in the bin, I think. Put it in the compost.
Dilute it a bit before you put it down there.
Yeah.
Maybe. My sourdough doesn't seem to rise enough. Even if I leave it for 4 hours, it has minimal rise. Please help.
Are you leaving it in the fridge? And is your starter active enough? So I think this goes back to having a really active starter to start with. Your starter is your yeast. Unlike packaged yeast or commercial yeast, you always know, unless it's out of date, you always know that that's active. With the starter, you have to judge the point at which it's active. And if you judge that wrong, then you're not going to get the lift that you need. So you really need to, on this occasion, do the float test. If that starter's floating and you're using enough of it, and you're using our recipe, so it's 100 grams of starter per 500 grams of flour. That's 200 grams to a kilo. You should get a lovely rise on it.
Okay. Can you make sourdough bread in a bread machine?
I don't see any reason why not, but I haven't tried it myself because I like making bread by hand. But bread machines are, lots of people use them, and I'm sure they're fantastic. But I can't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to, because you're basically just baking bread. But we're yet to try it. But
I would have thought it would work.
Yeah.
Let us know how you get on. Okay, I'm going to skip a few that we've already answered and try and get on to some that we haven't covered yet. Oops. My starter overflowed on day 1. Now day 7, it isn't rising. Some bubbles and brown liquid on the top. Should I persevere, or has it all gone wrong?
Well, I think you had an amazing starter on day 1. Maybe there's a lot of amazing bacteria knocking around. There is no right or wrong to this. I mean, you should persevere by pouring most of it away, and then giving it a good feed, maybe 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water. But honestly, I have heard of people's starters being ready on day 2, day 3, ready to bake. There's no hard, fast rules to this. You need to be the judge of it. And if it is, even though a recipe might say not until day 5, if it is bubbling away on day 3 and it floats, you're good to go. And if in your case it was bubbling away on day 1, then absolutely fantastic. You're good to go.
Maybe get a bigger container next time if you've got loads of sourdough yeast in your Hello, my starter isn't growing much, small bubbles but no frothing. Shall I keep discarding every day?
Not every day. It depends on how much you've got and how much you're filling your jar with. If it's not really working, then I would discard half of it and start again and see what's happening. And then, but just keep on feeding it, stay with it, and then at some point it will start bubbling. And if your jar's starting to become really big or not much seems to be happening, then you should pour some away and give it a big feed again, and eventually something will happen.
Okay, here's one for you, because I know you've been experimenting with this.
I know.
Is a good gluten-free sourdough possible? Any tips?
Right, I've been trying my hardest for this, and a bit like our white sourdough, and I don't want to sound like the PM and be really vague about what's going on, but and not be able to tell you quite what's happening. But I've been trying. So our whole mission with our white sourdough recipe was to simplify it, and so we had so much amazing feedback saying, you know what, there's no jargon in it. It really is the most user-friendly sourdough recipe we found. Now, I tried to do that with gluten-free sourdough, and I haven't succeeded yet. And so I've done a bit more research to it, and I realised that there will be one, and we are going to crack it. But there are some ingredients I don't have, which I think are pretty vital for gluten-free bread and gluten-free sourdough. Some ingredients I haven't really heard of, to be honest, that I need to search out and I need to experiment with. Because at the moment, the simple process of just trying to make a gluten-free starter and adding that to gluten-free flour isn't working for me. So I will persevere and I will try and find these ingredients, and we will, hopefully, before lockdown is over, get a gluten-free sourdough recipe up and running. But it is a bit more like good gluten-free bread. As you do a lot of gluten-free baking, don't you, Cassie?
No, not gluten-free.
Oh, sorry. So you do vegan. So you do vegan baking.
Free for my daughter who's got allergies. Yeah.
Yeah, but it isn't as simple as just swapping like for like, and I don't want to put a substandard recipe out there because I get asked this question a lot, and I'm really apprehensive to put a substandard recipe out there. So I need to, there are some ingredients that I need to look into, that I need to understand a bit more, or we need to get someone specialist to do it for us, because at the moment I'm a bit perplexed, but we'll get there.
Keep going. How much starter equals yeast in a recipe?
Oh, I love this question. So it's times 10, and it depends whether it's fresh. Depends whether it's fresh or dried. So here's the equations for yeast. It's half dried to fresh or double fresh to dried. And I'm sorry, we might get a barrage of abuse from bakers out here. Experiments have been done, and there is no difference. There is no difference in flavour between fresh yeast and dried yeast. The same do exactly the same thing. You cannot taste the difference, honestly. Like, big experiments have been done in America, and on a taste test, dried yeast is a lot easier to use, but fresh yeast people like to use because it's fresh, but there is no flavour difference. And then if you want to use sourdough starter, which is active, it's 10 times that amount. So for 10 grams of fresh yeast is 100 grams of starter, and then it's 20 times for dried. So 5 grams of dried yeast equals 100 grams of starter. 10 grams of fresh yeast equals 100 grams of starter. But you must take into account that starter isn't just the yeast. You're also adding liquid and you're adding flour. So when I've made other recipes like sourdough croissants, or so we've got a sourdough cinnamon roll going up online, I've simply converted the normal amount of yeast that I would use into starter and sort of taken the amount of flour into account.
Okay, great. We've probably got time for one more question. So here we go. My rye sourdough is usually very successful, but the last couple of times I've baked it, it hasn't seemed very active, and it's taken ages to rise. And when I have baked it, it has cracked around the loaf near the base. Do you think it was to do with the long proof?
Yes, if that was recently, then the weather has. I mean, I've seen my bread go from the hot weekend we've had. As I said, I've seen the amount of time change. About 12 hours because of the temperature of the room. So it could be the cold weather we're having. It could be that the starter isn't enough. But if it's 100% rye, which is a delicious bread, it does tend to crack. I mean, it cracks on the top anyway because it's quite a dense dough to deal with. So actually, when you make 100% rye sourdough, you want that crack to come. If it's cracking on the bottom, I would try upping the amount of water in it, and seeing if that works. And then it's quite a new recipe. If you go on to bbcgoodfood.com, we have got a recipe on there for 100% rye sourdough, which is sometimes called pumpernickel or Russian rye bread, but it's all very similar. But that's 100% rye sourdough, which we cook in a loaf tin. It's absolutely delicious and malty and treacly.
Sounds lovely. Barney, you are a fountain of sourdough knowledge.
Oh, thank you very much, Cassie.
We've come to the end of another sourdough Q&A, but we'll be back next Tuesday answering all your sourdough questions. And yeah, there's 2 members of the cookery team here every day at 12:30. So drop by, say hello, ask us any questions that you might have about cooking, and we'll do our best to answer your questions for you. Also, we've got a new Facebook page. If you haven't seen it yet, it's really worth joining. It's called BBC Good Food Together, and it's a really nice place to share what you've been cooking and see what other people have been cooking as well. So check that out if you haven't done so already.
And there is a sourdough course. If you search for BBC Good Food on learningwithexperts.com and you use the code BBC Good Food, all uppercase, you'll get 20% off. And then you need to search for BBC Good Food wherever you get our podcasts. And we have a podcast. We have a whole podcast dedicated to sourdough, which we did a while back, didn't we?
Yeah. We've got you covered. Podcasts, online courses, recipes, whatever you need for your sourdough.
Yeah, and we're here to answer all your questions. Ask BBC Good Food. We're here to answer all your questions. Now, we couldn't do these chats without amazing people behind the scenes. So big shout out to Hetty, to Laura, to Nadia. Guys, thank you ever so much for broadcasting this for us. It's absolutely brilliant to be able to come on here every day and answer your questions. And it's been an absolute pleasure to answer some more sourdough questions with you, Cassie.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you, Barney.
Oh, and you. I'll see you soon, yeah?
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.
Bye.